Okay, I got a couple weeks behind again. Forgive me. Let's go over Joshua and Jericho, which is what we covered in youth group this past Wednesday. Okay, so Joshua 6. Go ahead and read Joshua 6, 1 through 5. Okay, I'm going to assume you've done that. We are now in the conquering the promised land period of Israelite life and history. So there are 3 major military campaigns during this. And so we had some kids in class whose parents are in the military. And so we talked about what a military campaign looks like. Elliot filled us in beautifully. So Joshua 5 through 8 is the military campaign for the center of the land. Remember, this is the Israelites are going in. God had saved them from slavery. They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Now they're going into the promised land, the land God promised them. And so their military campaigns, it's chapters 5 through 8 is the center of the land. Joshua chapters 9 and 10 is the south. Joshua chapter 11 is the north. Okay. All three campaigns illustrate God's faithfulness. So we read Joshua 6, 1 through 5 again. The first campaign began with a detailed instructions on how Israel was to conquer Jericho. Hint, it wasn't by military might, okay? So they circled the city once each day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, they were to circle it 7 times. So the first question we went over is, why do we think God asked them or required them to do this? We talked about trust, obedience, following God even if we don't always understand why, okay? Another thing is, when we read the next section, we see God provided the method to allow Joshua and the Israelites to kind of intimidate their enemies. Remember, these enemies, they're bigger than the Israelites. They're giants. We learned about that earlier. So they have these walled cities, and the walls were thick enough for people to live in. They were apartments. So this is a way for the Israelites to intimidate the enemy, okay? So the shofar blasts continually during this entire process. Some translations say trumpet. It wasn't. It was the ram's horn, the shofar that we've talked about before. We then read Joshua 6 through 16. And our questions were, do you think it's important to follow God's exact directions? And that spurred a lovely conversation about why it's important to follow God's direct directions to us, and how often he leaves things up to our free will. But when he gives us a command, how helpful and how good it is to obey him completely. And then we put ourselves in the story, and we talked about what would be your reaction if God asked you to march around a city once every day for 6 days and then 7 times on the 7th day. Like, what were you thinking? Okay, what would you be thinking? So then Joshua 6, 20 through 21, we read that. And then how would you feel if you saw thick walls of a city? Remember, we talked about being thick enough for an apartment. They fall down flat, like straight ahead of you to where you could go straight in. And then what are some miracles surrounding this? The Israelites weren't injured and things like that. Okay, we read Joshua 6 verse 27, God was with Joshua and the people heard about him. Was the purpose of this to make Joshua famous? Was a question we asked, and we decided no. That it was to help him in his role of leader. Do we have any guesses about what Joshua's and the Israelites' next steps were? That was an interesting one. That spurred a really good conversation. And then the dominant people of this region worship false gods, and they did this practically by sacrificing their children to the false gods. God wanted that to stop, and he's taking the land from the people that are sacrificing their children and giving it to Israel. And Israel, the people of Israel, like at this time, recognized children as the ultimate blessing. So then we went over some children as a blessing verses, because that's you, and that's why we're doing this. So Genesis 15, 1 through 6, Abraham feels that material blessings are nothing without a child. Psalm 127, 3 through 5, children are a blessing and an asset that bring joy to your life. The question that we talked about after we read the verses in their context was, does our culture consider children the most important blessing, or do we consider them not? And we decided our culture is a culture of death, not life. Our culture is a culture that considers kids a liability, not an asset. Our culture considers kids to be a burden, especially a financial one. And so we wrapped up with talking about every person we meet is made in the image of God. Every person has dignity and a purpose. We read Psalm 139, 13 through 16 from the Hebrew Bible because it has just a little bit of a different translation and enough to kind of wake us up to some of the language being used. God formed us as embryos. What does that mean for us? How valuable are our lives? And how valuable are the lives of those that are around us? Okay, and that's how we wrap up our discussion. So thanks for joining me. See you next week.